Well, hello and welcome back to Roundtable Mindset. This is Jamie.
And I'm Malin.
And we're back for season 2, episode 2 of the new season of difficult conversations here at Roundtable Mindset. I am super excited again, because why not?
Well, I'm gonna say I'm not as excited about this one, and not for the reasons other than it's gonna be tough. I mean, it's going to be something that challenges me on a lot of different areas. So I'm stretching myself here with this conversation. I'm going on the emotional spectrum. I'm going deeper than I probably normally go in a conversation, and it's kind of spooking me a little bit, Jamie. So I'm not as excited, but I am so grateful to be able to have this conversation.
Well, and that's sometimes I think difficult conversations are easier to have with a friend. So we can do it together. I'm excited because of our guest. We have a special guest appearing with us today. His name is Jacob, and I'm gonna have you just introduce yourself a little bit.
Well, I am really excited to be here. I have listened to your show since you guys first started it, and when you asked me if I would be willing to come on, I was absolutely delighted. So thank you very much for having me.
Oh, thanks.
My name is Jacob. Yeah, I love you guys. So I am a therapist, a mental health therapist, and I work primarily with adolescents and teenagers. When you guys asked if I would come on for this topic, at first I was a little nervous, a little excited, but I think it's a really important thing that needs to be discussed, and yeah, hopefully I can offer some education, answer questions, and help everybody feel a little more comfortable knowing maybe how to respond when something like this comes up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and I guess before we get started, I do just want to take a minute and just offer a little content warning. Today, we're going to talk about some difficult things. And one of those things is suicide and suicidal ideation, and how that affects our kids. And if that's a difficult conversation that you're not ready to listen to, please do what you need to do to take care of yourself and reach out to a friend. But we're going to try and learn something and just share some experiences with you today so that you have the information you need to support those around you. So Malin, this is a hard conversation. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe why you're, I don't know, did you say you were spooked? Is that the word you used?
Yes, I used the word spooked. And as soon as I said it, I was like, is that really the right word? And I think it is for me, because here's where I'm at. I am comfortable in believing that everything is fine within myself, within my friends, my family, my children. And if it doesn't appear to be different, don't go looking for trouble. It's kind of my mantra, right? Like, if everything appears to be calm in the waters and the seas of life, what business do I have to go jump in there and start splashing around to churn stuff up? So I am just as happy sitting on the sidelines watching everything and assuming everything is fine, because there are no ripples, there's nothing happening. It's all nice and calm. What I'm a little bit nervous about, and I don't know if I want to say scared, is what if there's something going on that's beneath the surface and I never know? And so part of this conversation for me, the difficulty part of this is, how do I identify something? How do I look at let's say my kids, for instance, how do I look at my kids and I'll say my wife, my family. How do I look at my family and know that there's not something going on where it may, to them, feel like suicide is the only way out? And I would kick myself. I would hate myself. It would bother me to the core if something would happen and I've just been sitting around not noticing anything. So that's kind of where the difficult part for me comes from, is I don't want to be so removed or bury my head in the sand so deep that I'm not going to be able to see any kind of signs. So can we start there? Can we start with around what are some of the signs around people who may be considering suicide? I know that's kind of jumping into the deep end, but that really is where my difficult part of this conversation comes from.
Yeah, I think it's fair to want to rip off the Band-Aid and talk about that, the really hard part of it first. So a little bit about suicide before, and I will go into the warning signs, but when we're thinking and talking about suicide and how it affects people, it is an experience, a problem that affects people all across the lifespan. There's higher rates of suicide in certain age groups and certain demographics, but it affects everybody, or it can affect everybody, whether that's experiencing suicidal thoughts or what we call suicidal ideation on your own, or living with someone who is experiencing that struggle, or even experiencing the loss of someone who has died by suicide. Suicide really can affect each of us in a number of different ways. When I am working with my clients, and really just anybody, not even just professionally, but just in my personal life as well, some of the more common warning signs that I look for are like a withdrawal from their friends and family. So suicide is commonly tied to depression, higher rates of depression. And a big, an element of that is this internal narrative that we are a burden to other people, or that other people would be better off without us. And so a really noticeable withdrawal from spending time with friends and family is probably one of the more outwardly apparent suicide warning signs. Some others would be neglecting one's personal appearance. So if someone has always been very, well-groomed, well-kempt, their clothes are organized, or they just take care of themselves. If that starts to slip really suddenly, that could be an indicator that something is really wrong. People will sometimes make jokes about dying by suicide. I experience this a lot with my teenagers. So often I'll have a parent come to me and say, "Hey, my kid makes jokes about killing themselves or about dying all the time, and it makes me really uncomfortable. Can you, Mr. Therapist, get them to stop?" And to me, I'm like, that's actually probably something bigger that we need to be exploring with them is, if they are talking about suicide, whether it's in a joking way or saying, well, I'll just kill myself in a fight or something, the fact that they're saying those things means that those thoughts are already there. I think when a lot of teenagers especially are suffering or struggling, kids these days, quote unquote, will often turn to dark humor. That's what a lot of the adolescents and teenagers that I work with say is, "Oh, that's just my dark humor. That's just how I cope. I cope with dark humor." And we can use humor as a coping mechanism, absolutely. But when somebody is making those jokes regularly or talking about death and dying and suicide all the time, we need to be asking how and why that is coming up for them. So I think that then ties actually really directly to how do we then talk about suicide? So if you are seeing some of those things and you're worried about it, one of the most important things that I hope you take away from this is to just be direct. More often than not, I think folks get really worried that if they say the word suicide to someone, if they're worried about someone, then their thought is, am I going to put the idea of suicide into their mind? When in actuality, if you're worried about someone, they're probably already experiencing that or have thought about that. It's far better to just be direct and say, are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about killing yourself? Is that something that you're struggling with? It's much more, I think it creates more safety, honestly, for them to be able to say, yeah, I am struggling. If we can come to them and say, is this what's going on? Are you experiencing this?
And I think that's interesting that you just said that, because that is something that even while you're saying that, Jacob, I'm like, my body's clenching. I'm like, no, because that's so sensitive. What if I'm wrong? What if I start this conversation with someone who's not there, and now I'm talking about them, potentially killing themselves? And if they're like, hey, I'm not anywhere near there, I hear the spirit of what you're saying, and it makes sense. But at the same time, to actually go out and do that, I guess I'm going to speak for myself. I think that would be incredibly hard to be that direct on something so delicate and so personal. But at the same time, if that's what it takes to help someone, so that's the internal battle. I guess I just wanted to share that. Why I heard you talking, it was like, yeah, that sounds nice, but could I do that really? And what if I'm wrong? What if I'm misreading the situation and I start down having that conversation, and then what? Does that damage a relationship?
You know, when I first started my work, we have part of our workflow in working with families is to do like a suicide screener, right? So we ask very directed questions. And I remember sitting during my first day of working with that paperwork, and I flat out told my supervisor, I'm not asking any kid these questions. I wouldn't be comfortable with somebody asking my kid these questions. And then I went through to a series of different like suicide prevention trainings and things like that. And one of the things that they talked about a lot that really has stuck with me is that just that thing that you said, that it doesn't put an idea in their head. It just makes you a safe person for them to be able to admit, yeah, this is where I'm at. Because I don't know, I feel like it is so taboo still to talk about it and to know who can I go to, who's that safe person. But one of the things that I remember in one of those trainings was how to talk about it. And that's kind of the direction we wanted to go to, at least I would like to go, is, you know, talking about it with our kids specifically. And how one of the trainers that I had said something like, you know, try not to use phrases like, you're not going to do something stupid like kill yourself, are you? Because then that it almost makes a person feel like, oh, this person is not safe because they're just saying, I don't want to deal with this. Like the message that we give someone even, and that to me, that was like, that would be a way to ask in a less, I don't know, direct way or something. But listening to some of those things, when our kids are teenagers, they do kind of drift from us a little bit. You know, they do isolate themselves from us. I remember my kids spending a lot more time in their rooms, and it felt like they were pulling away or something. But some of that is kind of normal. So how do you start that specific conversation with your child if you're curious, if you're worried because you're seeing some things, maybe 2 or 3 of these things together? What do you do? How do you ask?
So you bring up a really good point that teenagers do very naturally shift from being very parent oriented to being more independent or peer oriented, where, you know, throughout their lives, younger children are really more connected to their parents because they rely so much more on them. They don't have the emotional insight or some of the emotional and intellectual abilities yet because of just where they are developmentally to have some of that independence. And so as we shift into our teenage years and we gain those things, it does lead to a natural withdrawal from parents and a big focus then on where we are with our peers. So figuring out what's normal for your teenager or for the teenager in your life can be really tricky because, like, what are they doing that, like, and so to me, the biggest thing is to start early by having those conversations ahead of time, by having those conversations without judgment and without some of that language, Jamie, like you mentioned, like, you're not going to do something stupid. If we can set a precedent of, hey, let's do a mental health check-in, or let's do an emotions check-in. How are we feeling? How are we doing? How are things going? A lot of times kids are going to be like, I'm fine, Mom. I'm fine, Dad. Or, you know, I remember I was a teenager in like the early aughts, so like the emo kid days, and I very much was it's not a phase, Mom. And right. So for parents, you know, we run into this situation of our kids like giving us 1 or 2 word answers and perceiving us as the parent as being like the interrogator. So some ways around that are just to take the kids for a drive. Like, hey, should we go get some ice cream? And then just like let them put on their music and fight the urge to start the conversation, because more often than not, a teenager is going to open up and start talking if they're just given some space. But because of that drive for their independence, when we start asking questions like, so how are things really? That drive for independence might come back at us as, well, if I tell you, or if I answer that, then I'm giving up some of my new independence. So spending time, like one-on-one time, whether it's 5 minutes as soon as, everybody gets home at the end of the day, 5 minutes one-on-one, just building that connection, learning that like judgment-free ability to speak about hard things. Like, I want to go back to what you said, Jamie, of how we talk about suicide, because I think so often, like, I've even heard other therapists say it, and I'm sure I probably have said it at a time, where it's like, you're not going to do something that silly or that stupid. And when we speak that way, it really does offer us comfort, because it kind of alleviates some of the emotional burden of the conversation. But you're right that the implicit message, or the unspoken message there, is, this is a topic that I am diminishing. Whether we mean that or not, that's how it gets heard. When we're depressed, when we're suffering, when we're experiencing suicidal thoughts, our whole lens, our whole perspective of the world gets really twisted. So something like that can easily be misperceived as, this is not something important. I should not talk about this, because that means I am stupid for having these thoughts.
So one of the things that you guys are saying, I think even myself, before having the podcast, and Jamie, we had a guest on earlier that spoke about suicide and a suicidal experience. Before even that conversation, I would have sat here and I would have argued a little bit about that point, about saying something like, you're not going to commit suicide or do something that's stupid, are you? I would have sat in this chair and I would have argued. I think I've learned a little bit, and I think I've grown a little bit in that area, but I'm not going to lie, because of how I was raised, because, I've had really strong parental figures in my life. As a kid, I wasn't lacking in the parental guidance. I'll just say it that way. I had guide rails, I had expectations, but there was times that my parents, they would say those exact things, like when I would have to be punished, or if it was a severe enough situation that was going on, they would say stuff like, well, you're not going to do something dumb now and go kill yourself. So now I'm dealing with what I'm hearing you guys say, but I'm also dealing with I don't know if I want to call it the tradition, but the way that I was brought up, that was how that conversation was approached. So now I'm fighting against how I was actually raised and how that conversation was presented to me. And it's hard not to just perpetuate that now into raising my children and having conversations with other people, because that was the model that was given to me. And so I just wanted to pause there to kind of just interject that a little bit, because it's not just, there's a lot of factors, I guess, that are working in my life, and I would assume people that think like I do. And how do you fight against those? Because my natural instinct would be to use the parenting style that was used on me, and that would be the comfortable place for me to go. So now I'm fighting against that as well. So it's kind of like layered on there. And it's like, how do you stop yourself in the moment to say, okay, here's how I should be approaching it, and maybe not necessarily just use what was done on you, because again, I was a kid years and years years ago in a different time where social media wasn't as prevalent. Like I try to relate to my kids, and there's this chasm that's there because they have everything they ever want to do at their fingertips at all times. Whereas I couldn't watch a cartoon without 5 different commercials where I would get up and go get my bowl of cereal. There was interruptions. They don't get interruptions. They don't get that reprieve. And so just even in that difference, it's hard for me not to just want to apply to my kids what I learned in a different time and different environment. But how do you stop yourself from doing that? How do you take what you've learned or what you've gone through and yet modify it for what's needed today?
I really think it takes practice. I thank you for sharing that, first of all, because I think that's probably going to be a majority of people's experience, that whether their parents would have said something along those same lines or not said anything at all, we all absolutely repeat what our parents did in their parenting choices. Like, that becomes so ingrained and just part of who we are as parents that it is really hard to like catch that automatic like response and try to change it.
You know,
to me, the cool thing...
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say the cool thing about parenting is that you don't have to be perfect. Like, that should never be a thing that people hold. I know people do. Like, you don't have to be perfect. So, okay, so you do say that, that question in that way. All right, so make note of it and try again next time if that's within your values. If it's not, then, you get to make that decision. From my perspective, as we're having this conversation, my thought is, can I provide education on what we know through evidence-based research practices is most effective? Frankly, if we're even having the conversation, though, that's better than not having it at all, I would think. Jamie, what were you going to say?
Yeah, well, and I remember when, I don't even remember how old the kids were, but we had a big shift in our family. The kids and I we had gotten our own apartment, and it was just the three of us. And in that space, there was a ton of shifting for me as a parent in that. And I think one of the things, I'm so grateful for all the people that wrapped around my family in that time, because we had, I had some good friends that really were helping me just grow as a person, and I had people supporting my kids. But, to be able to stop and make the space safe for them, that was the thing for me. And it's still, we still had things that came up that I didn't know were bubbling under the surface. And sometimes it surprised me, but I think having that space to make it okay to have the hard conversations. And that is, it's funny that even came up for me in this conversation, because I had completely forgotten about that, is, how do you make the environment safe to have those hard conversations? How do you, in the work that I do, and I saw it in myself too, to be honest, this automatic response when someone, like when you find out that your kid is struggling, maybe with suicide, or even, they're dabbling in drugs, or, relationships and things like that, that knee-jerk reaction that parents have, there is, that was the biggest barrier, I think, for me and my kids when it came to those hard things, was that knee-jerk reaction that I had typically looked like big, angry, mad, even though it was actually like scared, you know what I mean? Like fearful for their safety or well-being. And I guess I don't know that maybe I can go back and look at how I purposely changed that. But I guess what do you recommend in that space? Your kid comes to you, they tell you this big, scary thing that is, something that I'm not an expert in counseling, therapy, or suicide. I'm just a mom, right? How do I deal with this when my kid comes to me with that? What do you recommend if this does come up in a family setting?
So I think for many parents, anger is the easy kind of automatic response. Like that is how it is for, I would guess, most people. Like when we get scared, our nervous system goes fight or flight, and usually both of those look or come out as anger. Whether that's, I can't deal with this, I have to get out of here, or I can't believe this, I'm shouting now and slamming doors as I walk through the house, okay, you're a person. You're allowed to have those big feelings, especially as a parent where your kid's well-being is at risk. In my work with parents, and I do a lot of work with parents as a therapist for adolescents and teenagers. In my work with parents, I try to talk about what we call the rupture and repair process. So we have an emotional or relational rupture that occurs where, whether there's a fight or an argument or a disagreement, there's some kind of split in the relationship. And it's up to us as the parents to come back to the kid and say, okay, we need to fix this. We need to work on this. Because we get to teach our kids that that's how we can repair a relationship, right? Like, so you have the big explosion, or I can't deal with this, whatever. Okay, great. Then when you cool down, go back to your kid and say, all right, so this is scary. If it's scary for me, I imagine it's scary for you. You know, sticking with suicide specifically and not parenting in general. When you're the one who is experiencing suicidal ideation, it can be extremely scary. I am a suicide survivor. I attempted suicide a number of times when I was in high school. And when I reflect back on what that period of life was like for me, there was, number one, a lot of shame around, I grew up in a very Christian, like a very religious household. So there were very clear guidelines on what was and was not acceptable. And suicide was one of those things that is absolutely unacceptable. And so even having the experience of suicidal thoughts was like, oh my God, here's more evidence as to why I am a sinner worse than everybody else on the planet. And I should just die. So for many people, there's that element of shame, but then there's also the element of fear, because it is so opposite of human nature to want to die, right? Like we are hardwired to want to live and expand and procreate or whatever. So the shame and the fear, both of those emotions are really isolating, which is where I think the withdrawal from our friends and family occurs, is because we get these narratives, we get these stories in our heads that nobody understands me. People are going to judge me. People are going to tell me I should just go through with it, you know? And so a parent coming into those conversations, okay, so I've had my response, whether it's a harsh response, like whatever it is. And at the end of the day, the most important thing for that kid to know is that they're not alone. If a parent can say, dude, this scares the heck out of me. If we can say that to our kid, great, because then they know that they're not alone. And that inherently starts to change some of their internal dialogue of, I am so alone in this, to, okay, if it scares my parent and it scares me, I can lean on my parent for comfort from that fear or comfort from that shame. And I think that's where a lot of the guidance comes from on how we talk about it, is because we don't want to unintentionally reinforce some of those thoughts that the person who's feeling suicidal or thinking suicidal thoughts is already having. But again, I mean, no therapist is ever going to get it perfect. No parent is ever going to get it perfect. No friend is going to get it perfect. At the end of the day, the most important thing to be able to communicate is, I care about you. You're not alone. I'm here to help.
Yeah.
So Jacob, I actually, on my list, there's two things, and you kind of just wrapped them up into one. So I'm going to pick at this for just a second. On my list was shame and religion when it came to suicide. And so you kind of touched on, I think, the shame of the person who's experiencing the suicidal ideation, or, even, having those thoughts, maybe even the actions. But I have a story, and this is the closest that I have come to suicide, and it's not anything into my family. I was an observer, but we had a neighbor in a that lived a couple streets down from us in a town that we used to live in. And life was fine for this. And this family was a very Catholic family, and their kids, there was expectations that their kids would do, follow certain paths, act a certain way. And yes, there was rebellion in the household, because when you have teenagers, I don't think you can get around the teenage years without a little bit of rebellion. So there was some of that rebellion going on. But I'll never forget, there was a time when everything was fine, and then it wasn't. And from an outsider perspective, I remember the first sign that I saw that there was something really wrong in that household was the coroner's van was coming down the street. And we were like, oh my goodness. And we gave the family time, and slowly the story came out. And unfortunately, their oldest son, the night before, everything was fine. He acted fine, had dinner. He was withdrawn a little bit, but again, how do you tell if that's the teenage years or if that's just a personality shift? Told his parents goodnight, went downstairs, and the parents finished out their evening, went to bed, got up, started doing the morning routine, getting the kids ready for school, got all the other kids out of the house, and when the dad went to leave to go to work, he noticed that his son's car was still there, which was odd. So he went back inside, went downstairs, and that's where he saw that his son had committed suicide in the basement. And there was this shame that came over, or I don't know if I want to say came over him, but at least came through him. I have to imagine as a dad, there's pain. There's so much pain there. But what he was presenting to the neighborhood, at least, and I know, I wasn't a close friend to the family, and we weren't a relative, so some of that, I guess, is expected. But there was no talking about it. It was almost like his son didn't exist anymore, and I felt like there was a little bit of a shame of what his son had done. And so I was just curious, can you give any insights? Is that a normal behavior? And again, I say normal as in, I know everybody's going to react a little bit differently, but that was one that kind of took me by surprise. Is there such a thing as you can be ashamed of that as a person who, has a family member that has done that act? It was very odd to me. So I don't know if I'm making sense or not, but I was wondering if you could shed a little bit of light on that, if that's a normal practice, if that's a normal response when something like that happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like you said, there isn't ever like a truly normal way of responding to a death by suicide. I mean, everybody's going to react differently. Some families go hard in the opposite direction and start a foundation to prevent suicide, or, raise awareness, in other family systems really do try to hide it. I think especially in Christian religion, or Christian culture, there is, sometimes explicitly spoken, but generally more of an implicit message that to die by suicide is somehow a violation of God's plan. And so I think that really feeds some of the shame. I think when we think about what a family is dealing with in the aftermath of a death by suicide, or even a suicide attempt, parents, I would imagine, very likely feel that they have somehow failed. That, they didn't see the warning signs, perhaps, or they didn't seek help, right? Like, didn't, quote unquote, I'm doing scare quotes for those, it's an audio medium, so scare quotes, didn't do the right thing. And so, I've talked a lot about how the individual who's experiencing suicidal thoughts has their own internal narratives. Well, the survivors also have their own internal narratives, that I didn't do enough, that I didn't see the warning signs, that if only I'd had ... fill in the blank. And so I think when people are experiencing those things, it's a very natural tendency to want to hide that sense that we have somehow failed. It's partially like image management, like managing how people see us, how people perceive us. I think it's probably tied into a religious or spiritual or broader cultural expectation that when someone dies by suicide, that's such a shameful act that we simply do not talk about it. It's kind of along the lines of, in some groups, it's along the same lines. It's like if somebody comes out as gay or lesbian, and that individual gets ostracized or disowned or cast out. To me, it feels very much along the same lines of, this is something that is so egregious. This is something that's such a big deal that we have to circle the wagons and protect ourselves from anticipated judgment from the rest of our community. Even if the rest of the community isn't actually going to be judgmental, if there's that fear and that perception, people will do all kinds of things to try and protect themselves from that.
Yeah. And again, I'm a Christian, and there are certain beliefs that I hold and I try to teach my children. My mother-in-law, my statement that I'm about to make, and I know this isn't a theological discussion, but I just want to kind of put this in here because I think it's important. I think our listeners, I think we have Christians that listen to us and non-Christians that listen to us. And I think really what the spirit of what I'm about to share is more around how, as a parent, do I prevent my children from doing that? Is that a fear tactic? Is that a love, give them attention, whatever it is. We're just, as parents, trying to do what we can to prevent them from doing that final action, because there's nothing you can do to undo it if it's successful. And so there's that fear, and we've talked about it. But I know from a religious point of view, I've heard my mother-in-law say numerous times that if you can't kill yourself, because if you kill yourself, you'll go to hell. And I remember the first time I heard that and it hit my ear, I was like, yeah, I agree with that statement. And then I had to stop and think about it for a minute, and I had to go into the Bible, and I had to really, I've sought out the counsel of, other religious leaders and pastors and kind of walk through this. And I think even in the spirit of that, trying to be as a way to prevent people from doing it, I think it's a little bit of a loaded, I don't want to say that. It's a little bit of it backfires, I think, more than it helps. Because nowhere in the Bible that have I found, and if somebody can find it and point it to me, I would really appreciate it. But I have not found anywhere where it says, if you kill yourself, you lose your salvation. And so that's something that for me, I had to start looking at the other factors of why somebody may commit suicide. And if you talk about something that's depression, well, depression sometimes happens from a chemical imbalance. And if the person is not able to prevent that from happening, and they do end up going the route of committing suicide, above all else, we're supposed to love one another. And so as I was consuming this, I started seeing that that's not necessarily true. And even as I'm saying in this conversation, that also doesn't mean it's a free for all, right? Like, doesn't mean that everybody, if you're having problems that are severe enough, and you should go out and try to commit suicide because there's no consequences. And that's at the heart of why my mother-in-law was saying it, is because to her, it was, don't do this because this is going to prevent you from doing it. And I think she truly does believe that is a sin, that you do lose your salvation, but that's another conversation. But I think it's more of a way for her to just say, there is something here that is so bad, don't do it. And that way now I know my kids will never cross that line. And I think there's some people that hear that and they really struggle. And it does break a lot of different relationships in a lot of different ways, because I know Christians who struggle with suicidal thoughts. I know Christians who have tried to commit suicides, and I'm sure there are Christians who have committed suicide. And the first reaction of some people in the religious world is, well, now they're damned for all eternity. And where we lose sight of, where are we loving that family that just had a loss? Where are we loving the individual who just ended their life for whatever reason? Where is that love coming and supporting them? And we lose that, I think, a little bit, because we make it so black and white. We make it so finite that it's either right or wrong. I'm rambling now, but that was my thought around religion. I love being a Christian. I love the Christian values, but I think in this particular case, this is one where I'm like, I don't think this is a hard Christian value that comes from the Bible that says that there is eternal damnation for those who commit suicide. And I think there needs to be more love towards families and individuals when this type of situation comes up, because I think it pushes people to think in those terms, either right, wrong, black or white.
Yeah, I agree. And I just want to so I'd like to respond to a few things because you brought up some really interesting points, Malin, but for the listeners, I just want to pause here and say, I know I brought this up through the context of a Christian lens, and that's simply because that's my lived experience. I know that there are other religious cultures and religious beliefs that have similar or very different ideas towards suicide, and frankly, I don't have the knowledge to speak to those. So I just want to acknowledge that I realize this is a fairly Christian-oriented discussion right now, and that's simply because I don't have the greater context available to myself. So I was raised, I said this earlier, I was raised in a Christian household. My father was the pastor of our church in a small town, and that was something that I heard in church was people who die by suicide lose their salvation. The way I internalized that was as like it accentuated, it deepened my sense of hopelessness. Like, okay, so if I die by suicide and I go to hell, well, I already feel like I am the worst scum of the earth human being on the planet. I'm going to hell anyway. This just kind of seals the deal for me. If I am so burdened with sin or so burdened with whatever, and suicide just ties up that loose end that, okay, well, now it's a sure thing. For me, and I know for many other people that you can read all kinds of different accounts on, that actually serves as like a might as well just do it. And so where I can hear the hope in your mother-in-law's words, excuse me, that hope of let's try and prevent this by showing what, not just the immediate consequences of your life ending, but the long-term consequences of losing out on your eternal life with Christ in this circumstance. Unfortunately, I think it can very easily be kind of twisted and misconstrued as that like sunk cost fallacy of, well, then I'm just going to do it anyway, I like how you asked, where's the love? How are we loving people through this? And at the end of the day, I think when I said earlier that having the conversation, having that connection, literally just telling someone, I'm here for you, I care about you. I don't know what to do with this. I've never had suicidal thoughts. I don't know how to help with this, but you're not alone anymore. You're not alone in this. To me, that is such a way of expressing and validating that this is scary and hard, and offering that really clear compassion and love. When we can say, I don't know what to do, but I will help you with it, that creates a sense of hope. That creates a deeper connection. So I think we don't want to say the wrong thing, and so we spend a lot of time trying to plan exactly what we're going to say, when really just having that, hey, I see you're struggling and I'm not going to let you struggle alone, is just so much more important than doing or saying the exact right thing.
Well, and I do think I remember one of the things that I used to tell my kids all the time. In the community that I live in, we had a couple of pretty high profile youth that were very well known in our community that had completed suicide, and it affected even my young kids who didn't know these people specifically, but knew their family or knew of their impact in the community. And it was a great opportunity an unfortunate, great opportunity to just have that space, to have an open platform to talk with them about that. And I remember the one thing that I told them, and I continue to tell them, even as young adults, is that there is nothing you will experience that we can't get through together. I don't care what it is. I don't care how bad it is. I don't care how hard it is. There's nothing that we can't get through together. And I think they didn't always remember that. But thankfully, even as they've gotten older, and I think, it's hard when they're kids and teenagers, but it's not just a kids and teenagers thing. Even as young adults, I know that they've been in some difficult situations too, that has made it hard for them. So, and some of this conversation has kind of made me think about different populations that maybe, to stay in that vein of parents having this conversation with their kids or being aware of this and how and when to have the conversation. I have a perception that these kind of things are more prevalent than they used to be. And you and I, when we had talked on the phone, Jacob, earlier, just kind of in prep for this, I kind of shared, it's hard for me to know if that's because of the work that I do, because I see more of it just because of the work, or if it's actually that way. Is this a more prevalent problem for our youth? And are there specific, risk factors or things that we as parents can understand to know that if my kid is into this, or if they're displaying this, then that's a risk factor, and I need to know about that.
Mm-hmm. I remember, Jamie, when we had that conversation, I think I had told you that I had no idea what the answer was, if this was actually more prevalent, because as a therapist, I'm talking about suicide multiple times a day, mm-hmm. some days, and I realize that's, in this context, I have, that is a kind of a place of privilege for me. Because, Malin, you had said, how uncomfortable you would be to ask someone, are you having suicidal thoughts? Are you considering suicide? Are you feeling suicidal? Are you okay in that way? I had a whole class in my graduate program where we spent several weeks practicing having these really difficult conversations. And I've been a therapist for a number of years now, where it is just it is such a comfortable conversation for me to have that I realize coming on here and saying just ask the question, be direct.
Right. Right.
I've had way more practice than most people ever will in having these kinds of conversations. Jamie, going back to your question. So of course, you know me, if I don't know the answer, I'm going to find the answer right away. So, according to the CDC here in the US, youth suicide rates have increased dramatically from 20 years ago. Suicide rates had been pretty steadily declining for a couple of decades, until the late 1990s. And in the early 2000s, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, we saw suicide rates across the board in the US start to tick back up. From 2007 to 2021, suicide rates in youth, which is ages 10 to 24, mm-hmm. have increased by 62% in that amount of time. So that's a huge increase. And that number includes both people who died by suicide and people who attempted to die by suicide. A lot of the risk factors, especially in young people. So, suicide is actually the third leading cause of death in young people under the age of 24. And it's the second leading cause of death in kids ages 10 to 14.
Wait, say that again. It's the second leading cause of death for kids aged 10 to 14.
Yes.
Wow.
That is how
I can't even
prevalent it is.
I can't even imagine at 10 to 14 having those types of feelings or thoughts or thinking that's the only way out, because that's not my childhood. That's not my experience. Mm-hmm. And that's what I get to go back to. And I think that's an earlier comment that I made, is that the world where we were kids, when I was a kid, is a lot different than what my kids are growing up in. And, I've been bullied as a child before, and it's not fun, but I got away from it. And in today's society, there is no getting away from it. It's everywhere. There's people that break up from long relationships, and it's not a clean break anymore because people have intertwined their social media accounts, or they have pictures of their long relationship that's constantly coming to them every month, every week, every year as a reminder of here's all the things. So it's almost like wounds never heal in this environment and in this culture. It's almost like they keep getting tore back open, and so it takes longer for these things for people to get over and to move on. And I, I'm putting a lot on social media, but that's the lens that I'm looking at it from my kids. Is my children have purposely been left out and been known. They were told they were being left out. Why? Because everybody who went out on to see a movie together or went out to dinner all tagged each other. And so they don't even have to be directly mean to people anymore. They just know they're doing enough for that person to know they were not included, which is devastating as a child. It's devastating. We all want that sense of belonging and purpose. And when you can actively have that removed from you and rubbed in your face 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, I've seen it firsthand. It does something to the psyche, and it just it doesn't heal as fast as it used to do, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I mean, I can remember a time pre-social media and post-social media where it was like, okay, I got bullied at school. That was awful. I'm going to go home. I'm going to cry. I'm going to have my feelings, whatever. Then social media, like I'm thinking as far back as even MySpace, like the bullying then just follows you, right? Like kids can send hurtful messages online. Now we've got Snapchat and TikTok and texting and like all of these, like kids are always accessible to each other in some form. So I absolutely agree with you that the wounds of the bullying, of being picked on, don't heal because they're never given the opportunity to, without like some pretty drastic intervention of completely blocking someone. But even that has its own social consequence for a kid at school. I think it's a common generational thing, and this is a conversation for a totally different day, but it very much is a generational, a new experience. It's kind of a trope. Every generation says kids back in my day.
Right.
We all are guilty of that for all of human history, but this truly is such a completely different experience of adolescence that we're all trying to figure out what this means, what the repercussions will be. How do we protect our children? Like, it is so much. And in fact, staying with bullying, that's one of the key risk factors for a suicide attempt, because children and teenagers internalize those messages of worthlessness, of being, whatever it is, of being somehow different, at that age where they, again, going back to early in our conversation, where teenagers shift from being parent-oriented to being peer-oriented, that social rejection completely reinforces when somebody's already struggling. Mm-hmm. And then if you tie in, like Malin, you had mentioned depression, if we have mental health concerns or parents who have mental health issues, that is something that also increases a youth's risk for a suicide attempt. If they've ever experienced abuse at home, or if they've witnessed abuse at home, whether that's physical abuse, sexual abuse, or even verbal or emotional abuse, even just witnessing that, having the awareness that parent A is abusive towards parent B, that is an increased factor as well.
Well, and again, I'm going down my list, and you were checking them off a lot, Jacob. As we were talking, I'm like, done. There's one here, though, that I want to make sure we have time to get to. And I'm going to word this really poorly, and I'm going to apologize in advance because I don't know how to really address it any other way. I know there's a subset. I can't tell you the statistics, but I know that I've read stories where somebody has committed suicide and they've left a note, and within their note, it almost seems like a revenge thing. Like, hey, I'm going to get back at you by ending my life. And sometimes the experiences that I've had, and they're not many, and when I read these articles or I read about these situations, it might be a small percentage of the reasons why people will try to commit suicide. But in my mind, I just wanted to ask someone, a professional like yourself, is that common where people, and I'm going to say it's almost like they don't think 2 steps ahead. They think, okay, here's how I'm going to get back at you and you're going to be sorry. But they never think through the fact that they won't be here to see it. So like their best plan of I'm going to get revenge ends with them not being around to see it. And so I have it on my list as people that commit suicide to get revenge with people. I don't know if that's the real right way to word it, but can you talk about that? Is that a prevalent reason why some people will try to do that? Is that just an outlier? Can you help shed some light on that if you can?
I think you may have actually copied my homework for this because I also have that on my list. Yes, it actually is a very, very prevalent aspect. There are a number of different assessments for suicide, tools that therapists and psychologists use to assess the extent of the suicidal ideation. And in one of them, it includes the reason why someone is experiencing suicidal ideation. So the 3 primary reasons on this particular assessment are 1, to escape or end my emotional suffering. 2, because I feel so apathetic, I feel such a deep sense of apathy, or I feel so hopeless for the future that the thought of continuing life just seems miserable. And number 3 is to get revenge. A sort of like, you have hurt me so significantly, I'm going to kill myself so that you know how much you have hurt me. My death is going to hurt you, and that's the point. I don't have any statistics on that, but I do know that it's prevalent enough that it is in the research all of the time. And for many people, I think it is kind of a combination of those, that I'm experiencing so much emotional turmoil, so much suffering, and screw you, whoever, I'm going to do this to prove to you that you harmed me, and this is my revenge. You will live with the guilt of my death for the rest of your life. Is it a rational thought? No, it's not. And if someone out there is listening and they are having a thought like that, I would encourage you to seek support. Call 988. It's the suicide hotline, suicide prevention hotline. Reach out to someone and tell them that you're struggling. Even if you don't feel comfortable saying that you are suicidal or are wanting to die by suicide, just be in connection with someone and see if that helps. When we have this level of, I'm going to call it dysfunction, right? Because it's a function of the mind that is not functioning the way we would expect or want it to function. When we're experiencing this level of dysfunction, our brains are really not great at planning and organizing and thinking ahead, especially when we're talking about adolescents, teenagers, people under the age of 25. Their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is kind of like mid-forehead, where we are able to organize things and plan ahead and think about future consequences, that part of the brain takes a really long time to develop. And so one of the other risk factors is impulsivity. Is someone suffering, and are they highly impulsive? Because that without that prefrontal cortex being fully developed, they may not be able to regulate that impulsive drive to escape their pain or to inflict pain on someone else by dying.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I even want to approach this or not, because I don't want to be insensitive, and I do not want to argue with what you just said, because I do agree there's a lot of things that we're now understanding that the brains don't develop. You know, when I was a kid, when I was 18, I was adult, and that meant I was adult in every way. My brain was an adult. My body was an adult. My parents said, hey, we're done with you. You're an adult.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, like, it seems like, and I'm playing a little bit of a devil's advocate here. I have heard people say that is in other situations, not suicide, that the brain takes longer to develop in kids until you're like, I think it's like, what was it, Jamie? 25 or 26 is when it stops developing. Yep. I have heard so many people say that's just a cop out for their behavior. So here's my devil's advocate. The people that think that believe that, are they just going to hear that segment as another excuse to throw on the fire to says, oh, now this could be considered because your brain wasn't developed? You see what I'm saying? Like, there's just seems like there's this attitude out there that says there's a lot of things happening underneath the umbrella of, well, it takes longer for people's brains to mature. And so I'm trying to be as sensitive as I can with this topic and that comment, but it almost seems like, is it making an excuse for that behavior now because of what you just said about the brain developing?
You know, I think that solely falls on, okay, maybe not solely, but largely falls on the psychiatric community at large. We do a great job of letting people know that the brain isn't done developing in that way until our mid-20s. But the rest of that sentence is, which is why we need parents and teachers and colleagues and coworkers and mentors to help people, to help teenagers, to help young adults learn the skills and the strategies to make up for that, right? We don't put a teenager behind the wheel of a car and say, okay, do whatever you want, without ever teaching them how to drive. They have to take driver's ed. They have to spend time learning how to do this, and then they get their license. So to me, and I really appreciate that you brought that up, Malin, because yeah, a lot of people certainly use that as a cop-out, as a, well, you know, my brain's just not done cooking yet, so I can't be held responsible. In fact, you are still accountable for your actions regardless. You know, if somebody has PTSD and they punch a hole in the wall, you still are responsible for repairing the hole in the wall, even if we understand in that moment you didn't have full control of your faculties. You're still responsible for the consequences of your actions. So it's like a both and for me. Like, yes, on one hand, we around, you know, parents, teachers, therapists around teenagers need to have that awareness that they may be more impulsive, because truly, it's not that they don't want to or won't. Sometimes it really is they can't maintain that impulsivity. That being said, it's our job to teach them and support them in developing that skill. Does that make sense?
It does. And I love how you worded that, because it's almost, and I'm not going to lie, there's been some times I've heard that too, where I'm like, oh, here we go again. Another excuse why they are able to, you know, people are able to act this way because their brain's not done cooking. What I love what you said is that there may be valid reasons why your brain is still developing, that these things happen, but you're still accountable for the outcomes of those. And I think that right there, what you said was really important, because that bridges that gap even for me. You know, I try to give people, I learned a lot. I've researched a lot within just us doing our show here. And before that, and even in the last year, there's times when I'm like, okay, this is another reason why somebody can't do X, Y, and Z, because the brain's not done developing. And what I heard you said really bridged it for me, which is that may be true, but that doesn't excuse them from the accountability that they have for their actions. And that hit my ear really well. That's something that I'm like, okay, now I'm putting these two pieces together, and it's making me relax a little bit, because it's not just a cop out that they get a free ticket to do whatever they want to do. And I'm not talking in just the realm of suicide here. I'm talking a very broad stroke here. But what you said really did kind of put the two in good working balance for me, because there is that accountability that somebody has to be held accountable for their actions. And yes, it's unfortunate if different situations of how people get to that spot. It might be that their brain's not completely done developing. It might be PTSD, as you brought up. But that accountability piece is really key for me. And it really kind of locked it in. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah, that's something that I think, at least in my observation as a therapist, I know the rest of that sentence in my head, and sometimes I forget, I need to give everybody else that context too. Like, I'm not excusing the fact that your kid, was smoking dope behind the gym or whatever. Like, I'm explaining why that rationality, because, we hear all the time, like, parents asking kids, like, what were you thinking? And kids going, I wasn't thinking. And like, literally,
the best
they probably
answer
weren't.
Accepted.
Right. The best answer we always get is, why would you do that? I don't know. What do you mean?
No,
you don't
they really
know?
don't. They really don't.
They really
Right.
don't. Their brains are not capable of that type of processing yet.
Oh, it frustrates me, because I'm like, yes, you have to know. And then it's like, you guys are just saying, like, but do you really know? Like, is that truthful? You don't
See,
know?
and I can easily go back to my early 20s and know very well those decisions that I made that weren't really decisions that I made. You know what I mean? That I really regret and would not make again, now that my brain is fully developed and I can make informed choices. But one thing, I guess, just to start wrapping things up, I would love to hear from you, Jacob, a little bit about, are there specific things? I definitely agree in that, we need to build that relationship. We need to build that connection with our kids so that we can be that safe space. But if we are in a space, let's say we overhear a conversation with a friend, or we intercept a text message, or it's sent to us in without unintentionally, but we know that our child is struggling with some suicidal thoughts and feelings. Are there specific things that we can do as parents? We talked a little bit about directly asking the question, is this something you're struggling with? But what should I do if it's 10 o'clock at night and my child comes to me? Well, actually, or the police show up at my door because my child said something to a friend that was scary, and they're doing a welfare check, that kind of thing. What do I need to do as a parent to ensure that I can keep my children safe and get them the help they need to be better?
Mm-hmm. Step number 1, take a few deep breaths and count to 10, because before you do anything else, you've got to be able to maintain your own regulation, right? Like the police showing up, that's a great example. The police showing up because they said something scary to a friend who called for a welfare check, or maybe that friend's parents called for a welfare check. That's going to be pretty activating for our nervous systems. Why are the cops here? What's going on? What do you mean my kid said something scary online? Like, first, I need you to, calm yourself a little bit, because when we get that emotional activation, literally, we're not able to think as clearly, and our kids need us to be as clear-headed as we can. So we've got to calm ourselves first. Step number 2, then, is to say, okay, here's what's going on. Let's talk about it. Obviously, not everybody's going to use that kind of language, but finding a way with your kid to say, I really want to understand. I don't understand. Can you help me understand? What is it that's happening for you in this moment? Sometimes kids, unfortunately, do make suicidal comments without ever actually having the suicidal intent or thought. sometimes it gets used as a fairly like reactive strategy. Whether, friends are doing something that they don't like, or if they're in a fight with you, sometimes because, again, they don't have that ability to regulate their impulsivity as well as an adult would, sometimes they do say that without actually meaning it. So being able to empathically, curiously say, kiddo, this is scary. We need to be able to talk about this, and then kind of go from there. Step 3, and these are very, like, step 1 is a non-negotiable for me. The rest kind of flow them together as the situation warrants.
However you need them. Gotcha.
Yeah. But coming up with some, bear with me, some safety plans. So there's all kinds of research that having like a safety contract or a safety plan does help prevent a death by suicide.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people find them to be, what would you say, Jamie? Like,
I chuckled because I'm like, that's almost families who have been in this space over and over again. It's almost like an eye roll or something. It's,
yes.
My one of my children, she used to call it she had a real safety plan, and then she had her BS safety plan. Like the BS safety plan was the one that whoever was with her trying to help her safety plan did, and then she had the one that she actually would use because it was hers.
Right.
So
right. And that's a really important point. Like, as a therapist, I am very clear with my kids. Like, look, we have to follow this format because technically we know that it is going to be more effective than not having anything. Also, let's talk about your BS safety plan and what that actually looks like, because whatever it is that's going to keep you alive and get you through that crisis, that's what I want. Mm-hmm. Do we need to go listen to rock music at full blast? Okay, that counts. Go for it. Put it on there. Do we need to go for a walk? Yep, as long as that's safe. Like not at 2:00 in the morning without parental knowledge. Really, when I talk about safety planning, what I would want listeners to take away from this conversation is removing access to means. So means of death. So that is separating ammunition from firearms. That is keeping those things locked away without the person having access to the key. That includes removing access from ropes. Maybe we have somebody else administering medication. Even adults, even suicidal adults may need to ask for support. If your method for suicide would be overdosing on your medication, we need to have somebody that you trust lock that medication up and administer it to keep you alive. Because the situation, the experience of trauma, of depression, of whatever is feeding that suicidal experience can be temporary. Are there things that we never truly fully heal from? Yes. I'm not going to be one of those pithy therapists who's like, oh, we can heal everything, because there are some wounds that truly don't heal. And there are still ways of making meaning through our suffering that alleviate our suffering. So, deep breaths, regulating yourself, making sure that guns, weapons are removed, and then accessing resources. So doing an internet search for local crisis places. Most cities and even small to medium towns now have behavioral health centers that can offer some support. The quality varies. Your mileage may vary. Sometimes we just have to go to the local emergency room because they can at least offer stabilization and evaluation. Sometimes we really need medication, right? Like, I know a lot of people have strong feelings about medication, especially antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications. unfortunately, the fact of the matter is there are certain situations in which that's one of the things that we have to have in order to make therapy or whatever else effective enough to get us through that moment. A lot of people, I think, are rightly hesitant or reluctant to go to counseling. Like, I'm just going to put this out there as well. Like, obviously, as a therapist, I'm biased. I think therapy is great. And I also know that therapy is not for everybody. Mm-hmm. That sometimes when you've had a bad experience with a therapist, that's the last thing you want to do. Okay, then we need to increase your connection with somebody that you trust, somebody who can be there for you. And maybe if you change your mind about finding a therapist in the future, great. Isolation is such a key element to suicide that reducing that as much as possible is what we really need to focus on.
And I was going to add to, what you were saying about reducing risk factors, because I think that might be one of them also is, I think there are some situations where you may not be able to remove the means, the identified means. And so reducing that isolation and just being with your child the whole time until you can get assessment and get some support is necessary too. And sometimes I think, I don't know, just thinking of my own lived experience, sometimes I think that that's sometimes what they need. It really is a cry for connection. And so that can be helpful too. But, and I guess the other thing I just wanted to emphasize too is that 988 hotline is really, it's not just for I'm struggling and I need to talk to somebody. That can be a great resource for a parent too. If you suspect or are worried about your kids being in that space or having some of those thoughts or feelings, that can be a great space to go to get some resources and to have someone to talk to support you through that too. And I don't know that that's always understood, that it's not just for me, myself, and I, but it's for, people who are concerned about a loved one and can get some support that way too. So. Mm-hmm. And as a parent, I guess the other thing I would totally encourage any parent who's in this space is to make sure that you have your own support. I know, because I have seen this increasing, that means it's increasing. It's been increasing. Like I've seen this with my own kids and their friend groups and things like that. And, anytime our kids have a friend or a family member or someone who has attempted or completed suicide, that makes it more risky for them. And so, we need to, as parents, we need to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves so that they have the support that they need, because their friends are struggling with this too. And, it's not isolated like it felt like it was when we were kids. This wasn't a huge deal when I was a kid. And some of it might have been that we weren't talking about as much, but I definitely think that parents need to make sure that they're getting support too, because you can't dip from an empty bucket. So I know we're wrapping up, and I don't want to reignite anything, but my last thing on my list, and I really want to get to it. So, Jacob, I was hoping you could kind of listen to this scenario, and it's one that's probably the closest to me and my family around suicide, and I would appreciate a professional to listen to it, because I'm wondering if other people, we've said a lot with even this episode, and if people start putting any of this into practice, the outcomes from that. And so I actually have a scenario that happened to my daughter in high school, and she was a freshman, and she knew of a classmate that she really liked. They were friends. Their friendship was growing. As their friendship was growing, my daughter was being kind of drawn into that inner circle, I think, where that classmate started feeling safe enough, started sharing more of their thoughts and their ideas and who they were as a person. And they were growing closer. And one day she came home and she was really distraught. And we asked her what was wrong, and she didn't really say anything. And a day passed, and then another day passed.
And we could tell something was weighing on her. So we finally sat her down and we were like, what's going on? Like, what's happening? And through tears, she started explaining that her friend that she really likes and we're drawing close to had mentioned something about taking their life. And she was troubled by that, and she didn't know what to do. And again, I do not have extensive training in, suicide or anything, but I do know enough that, we've all been taught if you see something, say something. And that applies across a variety of different things. And that was the parental wisdom we gave our daughter was, if you think this is something that is, they're going to take action on it. They're not saying it just to blow off steam, that you really think there's some meaning behind it. It's better for you to say something and be wrong than to say nothing and be right. And so we put that on her. She took our advice and she did say something. She reached out to, I believe it was the counselor at school, because, who else do you go and reach out to? That started a chain of events that ultimately destroyed my daughter and this person's relationship. This person, as you can imagine, was talked to by the school. The parents were called. The parents came, picked up their child, left. This classmate was out of school for a few days. And when they came back, they were horribly mean to my daughter. Their relationship was broken. A lot of hurtful words were said. From that point on, this classmate made it a mission to make my daughter's life a living nightmare. And that was the status quo for a couple years. Fast forward to my daughter was a junior, and through happenstance, their paths collided. And in that moment, this person looked at my daughter and said, I am so sorry for how I treated you. I am so sorry for what I did in high school, but I want to thank you for saying something, because I was mad that you told, but I'm so glad that you did. And I think it has a happy, well, not I think, it does have a happy outcome. Although my daughter suffered for many years. I share this story not to try to get sympathy or not to kind of put the guy down, but I really would like a professional's point of view, because this really highlighted for me that sometimes saying something is not going to be roses and kittens on the other side of that. Sometimes you have to break that relationship, or that relationship will no longer be existence. But it's for the betterment, or it's for the betterment of the person who's saying something. So I know I just said a whole lot, and I know I don't want to reopen the conversation because we're closing down, but would you mind, Jacob, just providing some insight to that? Because that outcome, we've talked even within this episode, and, I guess my expectation, if somebody would say that they were going to kill themselves and you helped intervene, they would wrap their arms around you and say, oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. But that was not the experience that my daughter had. And she suffered quite a bit. But again, at the end, it all came back around, and she saw the importance of saying something and really the impact of it. But could you provide any insight to that scenario and kind of help maybe I don't want to say unpack it, because again, we're wrapping up, but just provide some guidance to that if you can from your professional lens?
That is unfortunately not uncommon. That happens pretty regularly, actually, especially I think with our teenagers. I don't see that as much with adults, but it certainly is a common trait among adolescents and teens. I think a big part of that is, well, and I won't go too far into the weeds with this, but depression and that kind of suffering in adolescence generally is more of a presentation of anger than apathy, the way adults often experience it. So suicide in this person's case may have been internal anger that then got fueled and directed outward. I don't know enough to say, but that's what my guess is. And unfortunately, again, that does happen. Something that I have heard was meaningful both for kids that I've worked with and friends of kids who were suicidal, is that the statement, I would rather lose your friendship than lose your life. Meaning, I value you as a person remaining alive and getting help so much that I would be willing to sacrifice our relationship if that means that you are supported, protected, and able to remain alive. It's not an uncommon thing, and yeah, I won't go delving further, but it's sad when those things happen. And a human life was spared, not without pain, because it sounds like your daughter really suffered. And at the end of the day, I feel like that would be a separate conversation. The individual is alive, though, because your daughter intervened.
Yeah, again, I appreciate that. And I guess my whole point of sharing that at the very end was just try to give a scenario the best I can that says it could turn into a sacrifice of the friendship, of the relationship. But to what you said, if that spares their life, it might be worth it. So I just mostly wanted to share that to kind of get your reaction to it, but to highlight the fact that it might not, the person that you are helping may not be excited that you are helping in that moment. And it might take them some time to come back around to really appreciate what was done. I just wanted to highlight that. So I have everything off of my list that I wanted to talk to you about, Jacob. I again, thank you for being so open to have these conversations and to be able to address this so directly. I know as a kid, I never had this avenue. I didn't go look for it, but it wasn't readily available. And I don't blame my family. I don't blame my parents. I don't blame the school. It was just a different time. And so to even as an adult, well into my adult, it's nice to be able to have this conversation so directly with somebody in your professional space, and also just with people to talk openly about it, because some of this stuff has been so taboo for me for years. And again, we've already said we perpetuate that onto our children and in the next generation. So if we can start being more open about these types of conversations, it's only going to be better for all of us. So thank you for coming on and doing that for us. It's so much appreciated.
Yeah.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It has been cool to have you on our podcast, Jacob. I appreciate you joining us. It's been a good lens for us. Is there anything, I guess, as we close up here, is there anything you'd like to share with the massive amount of Roundtable Mindset fans that we have that can support you in other ways, or even other resources that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Thank you. I think first and foremost, if you or someone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts or thinking about dying by suicide, do reach out. There are resources. There are people who care, who want to help. And even though it may feel hopeless and like there's no escape, there is. So a simple internet search for suicide help will bring up a lot of those things locally. 988 here in the United States is our suicide prevention hotline. You can call or text. The trevorproject.org is also a great resource. If you are interested in these types of conversations with a different vantage point, maybe a little more comedic, psychology plus fart jokes, as we like to say, you can check out my podcast. That's Best Friendhood. Anywhere you listen to podcasts. We're on a bit of a hiatus right now, but we've got some exciting things in the works. So thank you again for having me. I've really enjoyed this.
I'm so excited for the return from the very long hiatus. It's been a long hiatus, so I'm super stoked because I've definitely missed the two of you in your podcast. So I'm excited to have that back. But
I hope you have a shirt that says psychology with fart jokes, because that is quite possibly the best description I've ever
did
heard.
You guys have merch? Because that could be your comeback merch right there.
That's a great idea. We've never had merch, but maybe this new go around, we ought to incorporate that.
Definitely need some merch. So
you heard it first here on Roundtable Mindset Psychology with fart
breaking
jokes.
news on Roundtable Mindset. We never get to do that, so that's fun. But well, thanks so much for joining us, Jacob. It's been a good conversation, and hopefully we can see you again in this space sometime soon. So, again, thank you all for joining us for this difficult conversation with some great people here on Roundtable Mindset. We hope you join us again next time when we pick another topic to jump into. So, thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.